really was a project that started out. My talk today is Eastern Farmers in Tsekehne Wilderness, and this really was a project that started while I was doing research for my PhD on the impacts of the Bennett Dam, which I'll be talking about on Wednesday for my learning. And some of the conversations elders had with me about people who had come into the territory and done various things, as well as the fact that a lot of this was unrecognized outside of the community itself. So people weren't aware of it. And just, the larger conversation with this is actually getting to that awareness. Some technical issues there. Centered on the Finlay-Parsnip watershed and the Front Range of the Rockies, traditional territory of the Tsekehne is still to this day often conceptualized as wilderness. This perception hides the numerous attempts by European settlers to transform this area into an agricultural center. I argue it persists for two main reasons. First, the settler colonial narrative does not handle failure well. In short, rather than acknowledge the abandoned farms and ranches, it is simply easier to act like they never existed. Second, from a psyche perspective, it is potentially beneficial not to challenge this forgetting, as concepts of wilderness can preclude further attempts to develop the area, especially within the context of the conservation environmental movements. This paper will examine how both of these rationales were employed and what impact, if any, they had on future developments. Talking about my community, the Tsekehne, this is my great-great-grandfather, Charlie Hunter, who was the chief at Fort Graham when Treaty 8 was signed, not with us, but with other First Nations. Commonly known as the Tsekehne or the Tsekehne, the Tsekehne are traditional inhabitants of the Finlay-Parsnip watershed and the Front Range of the Rockies, historically comprised the Saloni, Slatonana, the Sasuchan, the Utuwachan, and the Tsekehne proper. Today, the nation is comprised of 4 First Nations: Kwadacha, McLeod Lake, Tsekehne Lake, and my own community of Tsekehne. Tsekehne traditional territory is roughly bound by the Arctic Pacific Divide in the south and the west, the Liard and Dease rivers in the north, and the Front Ranges and foothills of the Rockies to the east. The largest community in this area is the settler community of Mackenzie, this so-called Instant City. Is itself a modern-day company town founded in 1966 as part of the Peace River Project that brought us the W.A.C. Bennett Dam and the Williston Lake Reservoir. Like most settler communities, is located in the south. And outside of these communities, the dominant population is still Tsekehne, which should come as no surprise to anyone familiar with perceptions of Indigenous people in the Americas, that this part of the world is viewed as untouched wilderness. And a good example of colonial erasure, the original inhabitants of the Finlay-Parsnip watershed, the Tsekehne, are generally portrayed as an example of hunter-gatherers par excellence, wandering bands of noble or ignoble savages chasing ungulates in a vast mountainous boreal forest, barely leaving a mark on the environment. The original environmentalists. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. The Tsekehne are no more simple hunter-gatherers than the Finlay-Parsnip watershed is untouched wilderness. And this is an image from the Manson River Park, which is actually a park that my nation maintains, and is regularly used by the community for one big reason. It's the first kind of stopping area when you're driving from Prince George to Tsekehne, and that is about an 6 to 8 hour drive on logging roads. So wonderful place to stop, to go to the bathroom, to have some food, and kind of spend some time communing with the nature. As we all know, not all definitions of wilderness require the complete absence of humans and or any evidence of their presence. Historian William Cronin famously argued that wilderness was not natural at all, but rather a creation of the very civilization it claims to be distinct from. Not everyone may agree with this definition, but it is important to note that even those who object are not necessarily arguing for the definition of wilderness to be a lack of human presence per se. Rather, many of the critics of Cronin present his argument as too simplistic, with individuals like environmentalist Dave Foreman and biologist Bill Willers positing instead that wilderness is defined by the lack of human control over it, not the lack of humans. Indeed, more recent contributions to the debate over wilderness have focused on finding a definition that all can agree to, and or trying to move the debate forward in a new direction not connected to old criticisms. For example, Indigenous scholar Jennifer Redveers points out that many of the definitions are often quite Eurocentric and hold little meaning for Indigenous peoples. I argue, while this claim is true, it does not mean that individuals Indigenous people cannot employ the various definitions of wilderness to their own end. It is clear from the ongoing debate that regardless of how you define it, wilderness holds a special place of importance in the European worldview. Even Croning was quick to claim that his assertion was not meant to offend, but rather to provoke, and ultimately aimed at promoting the protection of wilderness. Clearly, wilderness occupies a place of privilege that sadly Indigenous people do not. Furthermore, given the eliminatory nature of settler colonialism, employing the rhetoric of wilderness is one option available to Indigenous peoples seeking to preserve what they have. It helped that almost immediately after contact with the Europeans, the Indigenous peoples of what became known as the Americas were often portrayed as living in a state of nature. As English scholar Patrick Bratlinger has argued, within the colonial project, the belief in social development, aka progress, was ultimately tied to subjugating nature, and in doing so making wilderness and wild things disappear. Among the latter category were Indigenous people. After all, as sociologist Joe Fegan reminds us, Jackson Turner's frontier was a place of hostile Indians and stubborn wilderness. It makes sense, therefore, that the preservation of some of that wilderness might allow for the preservation of some of those Indians. This statement is not meant to suggest that this approach is a foolproof one. It is well known that when it comes to the creation of parks, that all too often this rarely happened. Even recent attempts to include Indigenous people in the park system, while commendable, can at times be discussed and eerily similar to those used when introducing animals and or returning the park to a quote-unquote natural state. And this is actually referring to Jasper working towards indigenizing the park, allowing the Simpec First Nation to actually hunt in the park as their ancestors had done for thousands of years. So again, not necessarily done in the best way, but it is a good thing in and of itself, I would say. Still, the fact that numerous Indigenous groups have either created or are in the process of creating protected areas reveals that the above logic to protecting wilderness to protect themselves is not unheard of in the Indigenous community. So again, there's been numerous proposals, numerous plans, and numerous parks created in the last few decades, often in partnership with First Nations, if not by First Nations themselves. So there's sort of that logic there. I'm not talking today about protected areas, however, or at least I'm not talking about areas that were protected during the time period I'm looking at. Rather, I'm talking about unprotected wilderness. Here, the same logic can be applied, and it is often more problematic because it comes into conflict with the rhetoric of social development that wants to develop such areas. The struggle can be seen in the Finlay-Parsnip watershed. I've been working on this research project for a little over half a decade. It stems from my PhD research on the W.A.C. Bennett Dam and the wealth of evidence I found challenging the claim by the province, BC Hydro, and others that the Finlay-Parsnip watershed was wilderness unchanged since the time of Mackenzie. Indeed, as late as the 1970s, it was argued that the Tsekehne were recent arrivals in the area. Rather than being based on evidence, though, this assertion is made based on a lack of evidence. Archaeologists now know that the Tsekehne have been in this part of the world since the last ice age, if not before it. Funny what actually conducting field work can do. For the Tsekehne, first contact came in 1793 with Alexander Mackenzie, and following his visit, fur trade posts were established at Rocky Mountain Portage and McLeod Lake, the first permanent European settlement west of the Rockies and what became British Columbia. Throughout the 1800s, more trading posts would be established at Bear Lake and on the Finlay River, but despite all that has been written about the negative impacts on the fur-bearing Indigenous population, all too often the domain of fur traders is still portrayed as untamed, if not pristine wilderness. Make no mistake, traplands are a managed environment. Still in the minds of many, Joseph Robinson's famous quote that the company had quote that the company have for 80 years slept at the end of a frozen sea, and the invaluable treasures of this extensive country, a profound secret to Great Britain, remained true until the settlers arrived. Indeed, during the construction of the W.A.C. Bennett Dam, it is often said that the area had remained unchanged since the time of Mackenzie, a statement that, while simultaneously acknowledging the fur trade, also made the assertion that it had not developed the area beyond its natural state. A classic example of narrative forgetting. It completely ignored the history of mining and agricultural settlement in the Finlay-Parsnip watershed. In 1861, gold was discovered by 3 Europeans on the Peace River. The following year, news of this event would spark the Peace River gold rush. As gold rushes would go, it would be fairly minor, and many of the individuals who struck it rich would become free traders. Although many of the individuals who struck it rich would become free traders as time went on. As such, is often discussed in terms of the much larger Almanica and Cassiar gold rushes of 1869 and 1873, respectively. The former will lead to new settler communities in the Finlay-Parsnip watershed, like Germanson Landing, Hogum, New Hogum, Howelton, Manson Creek, and Almanica City. For a brief period of time, it appeared that this part of the province would receive a lasting settler population. To this end, the province would even begin looking into improving transportation systems to these communities, especially the 2 major routes starting at Fort St. James and Fort George, respectively. Unfortunately for the settler state, and rather fortunately for the Tsekehne, once placer mining began to decline, most of the miners moved on to the next rush, and these communities were mostly abandoned. I do say mostly because in many instances they still remain, and to the present day, both levels of government continue looking into improving transportation to them. Furthermore, despite the decline in raw numbers, the impact of these prospectors on the environment dramatically increases extensive hydraulic mining replace other forms of surface mining. So just to give you an example of what hydraulic mining looks like, and this is where you quite literally blast away the sides of rivers to try and get gold. So it can leave these huge pits. And you can still see these pits if you go to Manson Creek today. Probably a lot easier even today, as they had a wildfire this summer. Yeah. It helped the smaller rushes like the McConnell Creek Gold Rush of 1907, 1908 kept attracting new individuals seeking a quick fortune, and to this day prospectors are quite active in the area. Nonetheless, by the spring of 1911, the Fort George Herald was noting that many of the prospectors were abandoning their claims for preemptions. Most of these would line the rivers of the Finlay-Parsnip watershed, reaching out to the Front Range of the Rockies via the Peace River Canyon. It was this process that gave birth to the community where the Parsnip River meets the Finlay River and forms the Peace, Finlay Forks. Located on the same trade route that crossed the Rockies via the Rocky Mountain Portage, Finlay Forks was an obvious trade hub, especially as the area was developed and/or transportation systems were improved. Or at least that appears to have been the belief of the 40 or so settlers who established the community in 1912. They believed they would be the first of many, a belief that was not as nonsensical as it might seem, given that this part of the Rocky Mountain Trench was experiencing a boom in land sales fueled by the hope of the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway go with the Peace River Canyon as its choice to cross the Rockies. Of course, much of these transactions were simply land speculation, and as with many other bubbles, it eventually burst. The pit in this case was the decision of the Grand Trunk to use the Yellowhead Pass, as well as World War I. Most of the residents of Finlay Forks left the community to fight in Europe. Few returned, but some did, and they would continue farming the area alongside those who never left. In many instances, these farms would continue to exist until the creation of the Williston Lake Reservoir. They'd also watch and wait. The failure to secure the route of the Grand Trunk Pacific began a cycle in the Finlay-Parsnip watershed in which every decade would be a flurry of activity connected to some proposed development that ultimately would fail, often due to the cost of transportation. The 1920s, for example, would see limited coal mining in the Peace River Canyon and proposed mica, galena, and gold mines near Fort Graham, on the Indigenization River, and at Finlay Forks, respectively. And you can still visit the Indigenization mine today. I actually did that this summer. It is now entirely overgrown. You can see the foundations of some of the cabins. Oddly, the outhouses remain, and you can also find the rail lines that are pictured here. So again, there was a mine there at one point. To the limited extent, all 4 mines were constructed, but construction never reached the levels that were desired. Nevertheless, it was based on the predicted profits that they would create the boosters like Lawrence Katney not only started a second boom in land sales in this part of the Rocky Mountain Trench, but also talked about building a hydroelectric dam on the Almanica River and a smelter at Finlay Forks. The only thing that was needed was improved transportation, a main line or a spur line connected to a railway. Before either would be constructed, however, the Great Depression derailed all of these plans. It did not, however, stop people from dreaming on tapping the rich resources of the area. Indeed, if anything, attempts to get rich quickly expanded in the 1930s as individuals from all backgrounds began looking for minerals in almost every stream in the Finlay-Parsnip watershed. Similarly, rather than a railway, this time highways were the highways were the hope of the dream of residents who hoped that the Alaska Highway would run up the Rocky Mountain Trench, either up the Rocky Mountain Trench or on the west of the Rockies, and that the Turgeon Highway from Fort St. James would connect Finlay Forks to the province's highway systems. World War II would bring a halt to many of these activities, and in the case of the Alaska Highway, led to its construction east of the Rockies, only to see them revived in the post-war period. Once again, transportation would be a main stumbling block, identified by many. It would come as no surprise then that when Axel Wenner-Gren proposed a monorail in 1956, the province jumped on board. And I'll be talking about Axel Wenner-Gren if you are in attendance for my talk on the W.A.C. Bennett Dam on Wednesday. His proposed monorail in 1956 eventually led to the Peace River Dam, or the W.A.C. Dam as it's currently known, and actually would lead to the Peace River Canyon Dam and is currently leading to the Tsay Dam. So he originally had plans for 7 dams on the Peace River. He's perhaps more famous for being the owner of Electrolux. So the company made vacuums for many years. Within a year of a memorandum being signed between the province and Axel Wenner-Gren regarding the matter, plans were being drawn up to build hydroelectric dams on the Peace River. Premier W.A.C. Bennett would later tell of visiting the Peace River near Hudson Soap and having a magnificent vision of development and prosperity. According to him, a passing trapper laughed at him for seeing such things, often accepted as fact. It is important to note that he did not talk about it until after he had lost the premiership, and to date, no one can identify the trapper. In the past, I've speculated that he might have been one of those individuals who killed themselves when the water came up in 1968, rather than live in Bennett's vision come to life. Assuming the event actually took place, though, one is left with the question of if the trapper's laughter had less to do with Bennett's vision and more to do with it being one of many visions that always seem to fail. It also highlights one aspect of the cycle of proposed developments and the failures that I've not mentioned so far. Despite the flurry activity that accompanied the fur trade, the gold rushes, agricultural settlement, and failed mines, every decade the Finlay-Parsnip watershed has been presented as untouched wilderness. So there's this sense of untouched wilderness, even though there's been numerous attempts to try and transform it away from being Tsekehne land. Even today, after the W.A.C. Bennett Dam was created, one of the largest man-made reservoirs in the world came into existence, and it has regulated the Peace River for over half a century. People still talk about protecting the untouched wilderness of this area, most recently by saving the Peace River from its 3rd dam, Site C. Again, I am in full sympathy for people who are opposed to the construction of the Site C Dam. I understand the devastation it's going to cause. But I am also struck by the fact that it is the 3rd dam on the Peace River, and so the Peace has not flown freely for over half a decade at this point in time. If any history is any indication, though, they will do the same if BC Hydro moves forward on other proposed dams on the Peace River. So again, always returning to this rhetoric of it being wilderness. It would appear, therefore, that for many, what makes wilderness untouched is not the actual lack of human presence or the actual lack of management per se, but rather the perception that it lacks meaningful human presence or proper management. It is the same logic that told Europeans in 1492 that the New World was an untouched wilderness, despite all the evidence to the contrary. Case in point, the Tsekehne have not been included in much of the talk, because when it comes to the discussion of wilderness in the Finlay-Parsnip watershed, they are often all too often presented as part of the natural state of affairs. That some settlers see this state of affairs as something preserved, while others see it as a catalyst to bring about change, is immaterial to the fact that what matters is that in the minds of many, when it comes to defining wilderness, it is the absence of established permanent settler population and economically profitable long-term developments that benefit at least in part the newcomers that matters. Anything less becomes wilderness quicker than the evidence to the contrary can disappear from sight. Indeed, lack one or the other, as in the case of the W.A.C. Dam, and suddenly the Williston Lake Reservoir is simply a weird natural lake. In this case, the rhetoric of wilderness can be considered to be a trope of colonial erasure that ignores Indigenous developments and management on the land and allows for the failed plans of the colonial projects to be forgotten on the other. Bennett can have his vision, conveniently ignoring the fact that since the time of Mackenzie, settlers have been talking about harnessing the power of the peace and developing the Finlay-Parsnip watershed. Nor does it appear that the Tsekehne were quick to disabuse settlers of their vision of the Finlay-Parsnip watershed. This should not be confused with the lack of interaction with settlers and their plans for the Tsekehne homeland. Rather, it reflects a recognition on the part of the Tsekehne that as much as the noble, savage, and untouched wilderness are fictions, they nonetheless hold a place of privilege in many settler minds that is more important than the welfare of Indigenous peoples. What better way to protect one's homeland than to utilize the value systems of those who would destroy it as an attempt to protect it? Of course, that only works for those who want to protect wilderness rather than develop it like the Eastern farmers that I will not necessarily talk about today. Thank you. Okay, are there any questions? And this is a shorter talk, so I do acknowledge that.